John Kane from Let's Talk Native here. Look, I want to spend a few minutes to talk about something you may or may not be familiar with, and it's called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, I know a lot of people have different views of the United Nations as an institution, about its effectiveness, about who runs it, who controls it, who finances it. In spite of all that, I think what's important to remember here in this situation is we have a family of nations throughout the world that oftentimes will establish standards for what they expect other nations to live up to. And in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UN DRIP as it's sometimes called, that's what was accomplished here. And this was passed in 2007, so we're in September, September 2007. So we're just barely past 10 years of this thing being in existence. Now, there's not a whole lot that is brand new here. Many of the standards that are established in this document are standards that have already been established in various UN conventions throughout history. Declaration of Human Rights, commissions associated with everything from decolonization to fighting against racial discrimination. Many of the things here are just brought together and specifically listed as a standard for how indigenous people should be treated by the member states of the entire world. Now, this thing was passed in 2007, and it was passed almost unanimously. There were a couple of abstentions, but only 4 nations voted against it: the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Those are the only 4 nations, and they voted against it. They didn't just abstain. They opposed this. Now, they opposed this, again, understanding that most of what's in here has already been established through other UN declarations and commissions and protocols. But still, those 4 nations voted against it. And it's interesting to understand why. Part of what this document does is that it supports self-determination for indigenous peoples, in spite of there being a dominant culture around them or a recognized member state of the United Nations family of nations. What the UN is attempting to do here is saying, look, there are people who may not have reached the recognition of sovereign statehood. Or perhaps they did, but somehow that recognition has faded away, like for the Kingdom of Hawaii, for instance. But whether the family of nations recognizes indigenous peoples as sovereign states or not, what these nations have said is that there are standards for which the people should be respected. And there are conditions by which, in fact, the interesting thing about this document is that it is acknowledged, and actually it says very clearly that it is that it's the minimum standard. Here it is, Article 43. The rights recognized herein constitute the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples of the world. So this is not some high-reaching aspiration that they hope somehow indigenous people will someday achieve. They're saying this is the minimum standard. Now think about this thing. Think about this being the minimum standard, and yet 4 nations would vote against it. So 4 nations did not even want to reach the minimum standard for what the other nations in the world agreed should be the standard for indigenous peoples, for the rights of indigenous peoples. Now, that was in 2007 when the vote took place. Since then, it was somewhere around 2010 or so, during the Barack Obama administration and even during the Stephen Harper administration in Canada, there was a bit of a change. and so countries like the U.S. and Canada, and also Australia and New Zealand, they came around a little bit, and they said, well, we recognize the aspirations, and we acknowledge and support the aspirations of the agreement. Now, that seems, like it's walked back a little bit, and it is, because they go on further. In fact, Barack Obama said, we support the aspirations of the agreement to the extent it doesn't violate U.S. law. Well, that's the point. The point is, the international community is saying there are conditions by which indigenous people are living that are unlawful. And in fact, in the very beginning of this document, and for those of you who have heard me talk about the doctrine of Christian discovery or various other policies or practices that are discriminatory, this is in the preamble of the agreement, and it says, affirming that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. To me, if this document stopped right there, that would have been enough. It would have been enough to just say that if there are practices that are discriminatory in nature, that promote superiorities of a people based on ethnicity or national origin or race and religion, that it's illegal. And that's what the international community has said here. Yet the United States not only voted against it in the first go-round, but when Barack Obama, the champion of human rights, right? When Barack Obama actually changed course a little bit for the United States, he went so far as to say he supported the aspirations agreement provided it doesn't conflict with U.S. law, which was what the United States was concerned about in the first place. The United States was concerned that somehow this declaration would affect international law. And you know what? It should have. It should have raised the bar. It should have changed how countries viewed indigenous peoples. But it also should change how other countries view indigenous peoples in countries not their own. So when we're faced with a challenge over the Dakota Access Pipeline, other countries should care. Other countries should step up, and they should recognize that the aggression of the United States is in clear violation of this. Which kind of brings me to my other point. My point is that we as indigenous peoples, we need to cite this. Not because the United Nations has enforcement power over the United States, but because it's a platform. It is a platform for us to raise in the international community the very violations that the United States and Canada have towards this standard, towards this minimum standard. One of the expressions or the themes that runs through this whole document is the standard of free, prior, and informed consent that the international community accepted and declared should be applied for everything related to discrimination, to removal of lands, to the use of natural resources, to everything, any activity by a member state of the United Nations that has an effect, particularly an adverse effect to indigenous peoples, requires, according to the international community, free, prior, and informed consent. Now, even Barack Obama, when he was issuing executive orders during his administration, suggested not that free, prior, and informed consent be gained from indigenous peoples on policies or practices that affected them, but he issued through executive order that executive agencies and departments should allow consultation and should provide consultation to indigenous peoples on issues that affect them. Now, there's a huge leap between the difference between consultation and consent. Consultation is like checking a box. That's not the international standard. The international standard says we will do more than check a box. That if there is a practice or a policy that has affected Native people, then the member states of the United Nations should seek and attain consent. And that consent should come as free, prior, and informed consent. So no duping us with wordsmithing. No coercing us into signing a document that we didn't do freely and willingly. Free, prior, and informed consent. This document addresses everything from discrimination, racism, to assimilation. We still live in a world where, unless the United States provides us documents, their travel documents, as U.S. citizens, we are forbidden from traveling from country to country. That is assimilation. If myself, as a Mohawk, or as a Haudenosaunee, as an Ongwe, if I have to declare U.S. citizenship in order to travel to other countries, that's forced assimilation. Not unlike the forced assimilation of the past. This document says all peoples are entitled to a nationality. My nationality isn't the United States. No one should be deprived of nationhood. No one should be deprived of their culture and their heritage and their history. Yet that's what we see. So the reason I wanted to mention this, and look, this is the official copy from the United Nations. This is a small handbook size from the Indian Law Resource Center. In fact, when I ordered these, I distributed a copy to every counselor within the Seneca Nation. We should become familiar with these documents. We should use these documents, not because this document is going to provide us relief, but we should cite on every instance when New York State, when any member state, when the United States is in direct violation. And in legal proceedings. In fact, if a federal judge or a state judge says, well, I don't have to follow the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, fine, let them say it. Let them put that on record. But we as Native peoples, we need to become familiar with this first and foremost. We need to cite article by article when the United States or any of its individual states are in violation of this thing. We need to cite it so that the world knows. You know, maybe someday the United Nations will develop an enforcement mechanism. They don't have one now, but they are still a platform. They are still a platform to hear these issues and for us to cite these issues. That's why it's important. So regardless of your feelings of the UN, we should be familiar with what the rest of the international community has established as the minimum standard. I'm not saying we should accept the minimum standard, but we should at very least force the United States and Canada to recognize that minimum standard. Thank you.